industries that made them rich or for pet causes they have come to support. Equal opportunity interest groups organize to promote the civil rights of people who believe that their interests are not being adequately represented and protected in national politics through traditional means. These groups also advocate for their members because, in many cases, they are economically disadvantaged or are at risk of becoming so. Equal opportunity groups believe that they are underrepresented not because of what they do but because of who they are. They may be the victims of discrimination or see themselves as threatened. These groups organize on the basis of age, race, ethnic group, gender, and sexual orientation. Membership is not limited to people who are part of the demographic group because many people believe that promoting the interests and rights of various groups in society is in the broader interest of all. For this reason, some scholars classify these groups as public interest groups. Because these are often groups who feel that they have been marginalized by and excluded from the system, they may seek to influence policy by going around traditional channels and using less conventional means like protests, sit-ins, and demonstrations. Black Lives Matter marches, demonstrations in support of young undocumented immigrants who were brought to the country as children, the women's marches, and the #MeToo social media protest, as well as the marches organized by young people who do not feel safe at school because of gun violence have become powerful social movements that policymakers pay close attention to because they energize so many voters. A public interest group tries to influence government to produce non-economic benefits that cannot be restricted to the interest group's members or denied to any member of the general public. The benefits of clean air, for instance, are available to all, not just the members of the environmental group that fights for them. In a way, all interest group benefits are collective goods that all members of the group can enjoy, but public interest groups seek collective goods that are open to all members of society or, in some cases, everyone in the world. Public interest group members are usually motivated by a view of the world that they think everyone would be better off to adopt. They believe that the benefit they seek is good for everyone, even if individuals outside their groups disagree or even reject the benefit. Although few people would dispute the value of clean air, peace, and the protection of human rights internationally, there is no such consensus about protecting the right to an abortion, the right to carry a concealed weapon, or the right to smoke marijuana. Yet public interest groups are involved in procuring and enforcing these rights for all Americans. Because public interest groups are involved in the production of collective goods for very large populations and the incentive to contribute on an individual basis may be particularly difficult to perceive, these groups are especially vulnerable to the free rider problem. That has not stopped them from organizing, however. There are more than 2,500 public interest groups in the United States today. People are drawn to a particular group because they support its values and goals, that is, expressive benefits are the primary membership draw. Although many members are attracted initially by expressive benefits, public interest groups seek to keep them active by offering material benefits and services, ranging from a free subscription to the group's magazine to discount insurance packages. Public interest groups include environmental groups, consumer groups, religious groups, Second Amendment groups, reproductive rights groups, and human rights groups. Government interest groups, representing both foreign and domestic governments, also lobby Congress and the president. Typically, some lobbyists' most lucrative contracts come from foreign governments seeking to influence foreign trade policies. In recent years, ethics rules have been initiated to prevent former government officials from working as foreign government lobbyists as soon as they leave office, but lobbying firms continue to hire them when they can because of their contacts and expertise. Domestic governments have become increasingly involved in the business of influencing federal policy. With the growing complexities of American federalism, state and local governments have an enormous stake in what the federal government does and often try to gain resources, limit the impact of policy, and otherwise alter the effects of federal law. All 50 states have government relations offices in Washington to attempt to influence federal policy directly. Trump's presidency presented new challenges to government lobbying laws since he refused to divest himself of his wide business interests, many of which require the cooperation of foreign governments. As the many scandals haunting members of his family business and his administration made clear, foreign governments found the Trumps to be attractive and potentially lucrative lobbying targets. (11.5) Interest group politics. Different strategies for influencing different branches of government. The term lobbying comes from 17th century England, where representatives of special interests would meet members of the English House of Commons in the large anteroom, or lobby, outside the House floor to plead their cases. Contemporary lobbying reaches far beyond the lobby of the House or the Senate, however. Interest groups contact lawmakers directly, but they no longer confine their efforts to chance meetings in the legislative lobby or to members of the legislature. Today they target all branches of government and the American people as well. The ranks of those who work with lobbyists also have swelled. Beginning in the 1980s, interest groups, especially those representing corporate interests, have been turning to a diverse group of political consultants, including professional Washington lobbyists, campaign specialists, advertising and media experts, pollsters, and academics. Lobbying today is a big business in its own right, creating narratives to persuade the public, weaponizing social media, and backing candidates whose narratives fit with their own. There are two main types of lobbying strategy: direct lobbying, sometimes called inside lobbying, or interaction with actual decision makers within government institutions, and indirect lobbying, also called outside lobbying, or attempts to influence public opinion and mobilize interest group members or the general public to contact their elected representatives on an issue. Some groups have resorted to more confrontational indirect methods, using political protests, often developing into full-blown social movements, to make their demands heard by policymakers. Recently, corporations and other more traditional interest groups have been combining tactics, joining conventional lobbying methods with the use of email, computerized databases, talk radio, and 24-hour cable TV to bring unprecedented pressure to bear on the voting public to influence members of government. Direct lobbying. Direct lobbying involves face-to-face interaction between lobbyists and members of government. We tend to think of Congress as the typical recipient of lobbying efforts, but the president, the bureaucracy, and even the courts are also the focus of efforts to influence policy. Lobbying Congress. When interest groups lobby Congress, they rarely concentrate on all 435 members of the House or all 100 members of the Senate. Rather, lobbyists focus their efforts on congressional committees, because that is where most bills are written and revised. Because the committee leadership is relatively stable from one Congress to the next, unless a different party wins a majority, lobbyists can develop long-term relationships with committee members and their staffs. These personal contacts, which might take place at meetings, banquets, parties, or lunches, or simply in casual meetings in the hallways of Congress, are important because they represent major means through which interest groups provide information to members of Congress. This is the most common and most effective form of lobbying strategy. Much of modern-day lobbying also involves the use of hired guns, or professional lobbyists, many of them former government officials, put on retainer by a client to lobby for that client's interests. Rotating into lobbying jobs from elected or other government positions is known as passing through the revolving door, a concept we encounter again in Chapter 13. It refers to public officials who leave their posts to become interest group representatives, or media figures, parlaying the special knowledge and contacts they gathered in government into lucrative salaries in the private sector. Revolving door activity is subject to occasional attempts at regulation and frequent ethical debate because it raises questions about whether people should be able to convert public service into private profit, and whether such an incentive draws people into public office for motives other than serving the public interest. President Obama felt so strongly that the revolving door was a breach of the public trust that early in his administration he signed an executive order prohibiting presidential appointees from working as lobbyists for 2 years after leaving their posts and from returning to lobby the executive branch during his time in office. In support of his oft-repeated intention to drain the swamp, Trump signed an executive order requiring administration appointees to pledge not to lobby the agencies for which they worked for 5 years. Nonetheless, one investigation found that of the nearly 200 people who left Trump's administration in his first year and a half in office, several had gone on to lobbying jobs by obtaining waivers allowing them to do so, by working part-time so that they didn't have to register as lobbyists, or, in one case, by refusing to sign the pledge at all. On the flip side of the revolving door, ProPublica, a non-profit public watchdog, found that 187 members of the Trump administration had previously tried to influence the agencies they were now hired to lead. Interest groups also lobby congressional decision-makers by providing testimony and expertise, and sometimes they even draft legislation on many issues on which policymakers cannot take the time to become expert. Information is one of the most important resources lobbyists can bring to their effort to influence Congress. Giving money to candidates is another lobbying technique that helps interest groups gain access and a friendly ear. See Figure 11.3. The 1974 Federal Election Campaign Act, passed in an effort to curb campaign spending abuses, sought to regulate the amount of money an interest group can give to candidates for federal office by providing for political action committees, PACs, which serve as fundraisers for interest groups. There are strict limitations on how much money PACs can donate to a candidate, but a number of loopholes allow them to get around some of the restrictions. These loopholes have been enhanced since 2010, when the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission essentially removed any limits on political expenditures by corporations and unions. Interest groups also attempt to bolster their lobbying efforts by forming coalitions with other interest groups. These coalitions tend to be based on single issues, and building such coalitions has become an important strategy in lobbying Congress. Many attempts have been made to regulate the tight relationships between lobbyists and lawmakers. The difficulty, of course, is that lawmakers benefit from their relationships with lobbyists in many ways and are not enthusiastic about curtailing their opportunities to get money and support. Congress completed its first attempt to regulate lobbying in half a century when it passed the Lobbying Disclosure Act in 1995. The act requires lobbyists to report how much they are paid, by whom, and what issues they are promoting. Also in 1995, both the Senate and the House passed separate resolutions addressing gifts and travel opportunities given by interest groups to senators and representatives. These reforms have not closed the door on lavish spending by lobbyists, although initially the rule changes cast a definite chill on lobbyist activities. As lobbyists and members of Congress have learned where they can bend the rules, however, relations between them have returned to a more familiar footing. The 2005 scandals involving lobbyist Jack Abramoff touched a number of Congress members, including the powerful Republican Tom DeLay, showing that the potential for corrupt relationships between lawmakers and lobbyists is as great as ever. Partly in reaction, in September 2007, after the Democrats took back the majority in the House and the Senate in 2006, Congress passed and President Bush signed the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, which tightened travel and gift restrictions. The combination of the 2007 reform and President Obama's limitations on lobbyists' access to the White House led to a significant drop in lobbying. The number of registered lobbyists dropped from 14,840 to 12,340 between 2007 and 2013. Nevertheless, lobbying groups scrambled to find new ways to provide travel for lawmakers they wanted to influence, and ways to make free meals acceptable. Lobbying the president, the bureaucracy, and the courts. Lobbyists also target the president and the White House staff to try to influence policy. As with Congress, personal contacts within the White House are extremely important, and the higher up, the better. The official contact point between the White House and interest groups is the Office of Public Engagement. The basic purpose of this office is to foster good relations between the White House and interest groups in order to mobilize these groups to support the administration's policies. In the case of the Trump White House, lobbying was slightly different because the president retained his private business interests. It was relatively easy for groups seeking to gain access to the president to do so by staying at one of his many properties, especially Mar-a-Lago, where he himself spent so much of his time. Public Citizen, a public watchdog group, found that in the president's first year in office, 64 industry groups, corporations, foreign governments, and political groups and candidates spent money at Trump properties. It is probably impossible to trace any explicit quid pro quo arrangements without seeing more financial records, but one of the reasons presidents have historically divested themselves of their financial interests or put them into blind trusts is to avoid any appearance of conflicts of interest. Whereas opportunities for lobbying the president are normally somewhat limited, opportunities for lobbying the rest of the executive branch abound. Interest groups know that winning the legislative battle is only the first step. The second, and sometimes more important, battle takes place in the bureaucracy, where Congress has delegated rulemaking authority to federal agencies that implement the law. Interest groups often try to gain an advantage by developing strong relations with regulating agencies. Because many of the experts on a topic are employed by the interests being regulated, it is not unusual to find lobbyists being hired by government agencies, or vice versa, in an extension of the revolving door situation we discussed earlier. The close relationships that exist between the regulated and the regulators, along with the close relationships between lobbyists and congressional staffs, lead to the creation of iron triangles, see Chapter 8. Interest groups try to influence government policy by challenging the legality of laws or administrative regulations in the courts. These legal tactics have been used by groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Anti-Discrimination Cases, the American Civil Liberties Union, Freedom of Speech, Freedom of Religion, and Civil Liberties Cases, the Sierra Club, Environmental Enforcement, and Common Cause, Ethics in Government. Sometimes groups bring cases directly, and sometimes they file amicus curiae, friend of the court, briefs asking the courts to rule in ways favoring their positions. Indirect lobbying. One of the most powerful and fastest-growing kinds of lobbying is indirect lobbying, in which lobbyists use public opinion to put pressure on politicians to do what the lobbyists want. Interest groups use the public to lobby and influence government decision-makers in a variety of ways. In a mediated world, the possibilities for informing and activating citizens have exploded. Many interest group leaders are sure that people will rally to their side once they know the truth about their causes, and so they set out to educate the public. They conduct extensive research to make their cases and court the media and hire public relations firms to get their ideas across. An increasingly popular way for interest groups to promote their message has been by using issue advocacy ads, which encourage constituents to support or oppose a certain policy or candidate without directly telling them how to vote. Such ads skirted campaign finance law that limited the money groups could spend to advocate for candidates directly, but since the 2010 Supreme Court case Citizens United, groups can raise funds and spend freely to support their favorite candidates. Groups can also get information to the public through the skillful use of the internet, whether through carefully designed advocacy websites and blogs, through social networks, or through web-based videos, creating messages that go viral, spreading quickly by email and hitting targeted audiences. Internet-savvy interest groups are increasingly turning to YouTube for a cheap and efficient way to get their message out. Lobbyists have used YouTube on behalf of such diverse interests as the Science Coalition, a group of research universities, Concerned Families for ATV Safety, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which lobbies against U.S. government energy standards. The point of disseminating information, hiring public relations firms, and running issue advocacy ads is to motivate the public to lobby politicians themselves. As you might expect, groups like ARP, the Christian Coalition, and the NRA, which are blessed with large memberships, have an advantage because they can mobilize a large contingent of citizens from all over the country to lobby representatives, senators, and the president. Generally, this mobilization involves encouraging members to write letters, send email messages or comments on social media, or make phone calls to legislators about a pending issue. A discussion of interest group politics would not be complete without mention of the unconventional technique of social protest. Throughout our history, groups have turned to social protest, activities ranging from planned, orderly demonstrations to strikes and boycotts, to acts of civil disobedience, when other techniques have failed to bring attention to their causes. Social media have greatly expanded the tools that protesters can use, even as it brings hazards that people will focus on online advocacy at the risk of foregoing more conventional and necessary political action like voting. Like other grassroots lobbying techniques, the techniques of social protest provide a way for people, often those closed out from more traditional avenues of political action, to publicly disseminate a narrative expressing their disagreement with a government policy or action. Thus, demonstrations and protests have frequently served an important function for those who have been excluded from the political process because of their minority, social, or economic status. While social protests may have the same objective as other types of indirect lobbying, that is, spreading the narrative, educating the public, and mobilizing the group's members, demonstrations and spontaneous protests also aim to draw in citizens who have not yet formed an opinion or to change the minds of those who have. Such actions may turn a political action into a mass movement, attracting formerly passive or uninterested observers to the cause. The media explosion of the modern age, especially the advent of the internet, has given social protesters many more ways to find each other and organize. Social analysts also have observed that the internet has facilitated the growth of groups like militias and white supremacist organizations that previously dwelled on the fringes of society. More recently, women engaged in social demonstrations against the Trump administration's policies toward women by marching the day after his inauguration and again 1 year later. The #MeToo movement, focused on holding men, or more rarely, women, accountable for sexual harassment and sexual assault, spread through social media and resulted in the indictments or firings of such powerful men as Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, NBC anchor Matt Lauer, and PBS and CBS host Charlie Rose. In 2018, following the shootings at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, students organized walkouts from schools in a day of national protest against the ease with which military-style assault weapons could be obtained. Black Lives Matter became a powerful rallying cry again in the summer of 2020, right before the fall election season. Sadly, the number of black deaths at the hands of police did not diminish as the summer went on, and the political action culminated with the naming of Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. Although it isn't possible to gauge the impact this social action had on the election, turnout was up for both parties in 2020. AstroTurf political campaigns, democratic or elite-driven? The indirect lobbying we just discussed is often called grassroots lobbying, meaning that it addresses people in their roles as ordinary citizens. It is the wielding of power from the bottom, roots, up, rather than from the top down. Most of what we refer to as grassroots lobbying, however, does not spring spontaneously from the people but is orchestrated by elites, leading some people to call it AstroTurf lobbying, indicating that it is not genuine. Often the line between real grassroots and AstroTurf lobbying is blurred, however. A movement may be partly spontaneous but partly orchestrated. Move On is an example of a group that started out as a spontaneous expression of the popular will to lobby Congress against the impeachment of President Clinton, but that spread by word of mouth over the internet. Similarly, the Tea Party movement was, in part, the project of Dick Armey, a former Republican House Majority Leader whose organization, FreedomWorks, promotes low taxes and small government. FreedomWorks and several other conservative groups, as well as prominent individuals including some commentators at Fox News, have lent their organizational expertise to the Tea Partiers but deny that they are orchestrating an AstroTurf movement. Regardless of how it started out, the Tea Party movement has certainly acquired a life and mind, perhaps several minds, of its own as many of its policy preferences have come to define the party's mainstream. One media consultant has predicted that direct lobbying will become less important as indirect lobbying increases in effectiveness and popularity. Although indirect lobbying seems on its face to be more democratic, to the extent that it manipulates public opinion, it may in fact be less so. At the same time, to the extent that Americans can become more sophisticated mediated citizens, there are ever more tools for them to create their own narratives. 11.6 Interest group resources. Using money, leadership, membership, and information to make their voices heard. Interest group success depends in large part on the resources a group can bring to the project of influencing government. The pluralist defense of interest groups is that all citizens have the opportunity to organize, and thus all can exercise equal power. But all interest groups are not created equal. Some have more money, more effective leadership, more members, or better information than others, and these resources can translate into real power differences in the high-stakes world of American politics, and consequently into real winners and losers. In this section we examine the resources that interest groups can draw on: money, leadership, membership, and information to get what they want from government. Money. Interest groups need money to conduct the business of trying to influence government policymakers. Money can buy an interest group the ability to put together a well-trained staff, to hire outside professional assistants, and to make campaign contributions in the hope of gaining access to government officials. Having money does not guarantee favorable policies, but not having money just about guarantees failure. One of the reasons money is important is that it enables an interest group to hire a professional staff, usually an executive director, assistants, and other office support personnel. The main job of this professional staff is to take care of the group's day-to-day operations, including pursuing policy initiatives, recruiting and maintaining membership, providing membership services, and, of course, getting more money through direct mailings, telemarketing, and organizational functions. Money is important for creating an organizational infrastructure that can in turn be used to raise additional support and resources. Money also enables the interest group to hire the services of professionals, such as a high-powered lobbying firm. Such firms have invested heavily to ensure that they have connections to members of Congress. A well-endowed group also can hire a public relations firm to help shape public opinion on a particular policy. Interest groups live by the axiom that to receive, one must give, and give a lot to important people. The maximum that any PAC can give to a congressional campaign is $5,000 for each separate election. While some PACs give millions to campaigns, most PACs give less than $50,000 to candidates for each election cycle, focusing their contributions on members of the committees responsible for drafting legislation important to their groups. In the wake of the Citizens United decision, however, considerable money can be spent by groups on a candidate's behalf, and the groups don't have to disclose the donors' identities. It has become apparent that although the Citizens United decision made only small changes to campaign finance law, it had the psychological effect of giving a green light to those who wanted to spend lavishly on an election. In 2016, the so-called super PACs unleashed by Citizens United spent more than $1 billion, though it wasn't clear that all that money had a real impact on the outcome of the elections, at least in the presidential and Senate races. PAC spending is usually directed toward incumbents of both parties, with incumbents in the majority party, especially committee chairs, getting the greatest share. About 80% of PAC contributions go to incumbent members of Congress. Although most PACs want to curry favor with incumbents of either party, some tend to channel their money to one party. For instance, business interests, the American Medical Association, pro-life groups, Christian groups, and the NRA tend to support Republican candidates, and labor groups, the Association of Trial Lawyers of America, the National Education Association, and environmental and pro-choice groups give primarily to Democrats. The ability to make sizable and strategically placed campaign contributions buys an interest group access to government officials. Access gives the interest group the ability to talk to a representative and members of their staff and to present information relevant to the policies they seek to initiate, change, or protect. Access is important because representatives have any number of competing interests vying for their time. Money is meant to oil the door hinge of a representative's office so that it swings open for the interest group. For instance, a $175,000 donation to the Republican National Committee over 4 years yielded a 3-day private event between the donors and the Republican leadership of Congress. The Clinton administration was known in its early years for allowing major donors to stay in the Lincoln bedroom of the White House. The access bought by campaign contributions is usually less blatant, but officials know who has supported their campaigns, and they are unlikely to forget it when interest groups come knocking at their doors. The relationship between money and political influence is extremely controversial. Many critics argue that this money buys more than just access; they say it buys votes. The circumstantial evidence for this contention is strong. For instance, in the Senate deliberations on a public option in healthcare, which would have provided individuals with an alternative to private healthcare insurance, the 30 senators who supported the public option had received an average of $15,937 in contributions from the healthcare industry in the previous 6 years, compared to the $37,322 that was received, on average, by the 70 senators who opposed it. However, in the matter of vote buying, systematic studies of congressional voting patterns are mixed. These studies show that the influence of campaign contributions is strongest in committees, where most bills are drafted. Once a bill reaches the floor of the House or the Senate, though, there is no consistent link between campaign contributions and roll call voting. This suggests that campaign contributions influence the process of creating and shaping legislation, and thus defining the policy alternatives. Nonetheless, the final outcome of a bill is determined by political circumstances that go beyond the campaign contributions of interest groups. Leadership. Leadership is an intangible element in the success or failure of an interest group. The strong, effective leadership of what one scholar has called interest group entrepreneurs can help a group organize even if it lacks other resources. Such a leader can keep a group going when it seems to lack support from other sources. Cesar Chavez's leadership of the United Farm Workers in the mid-1950s through the early 1990s is an excellent case in point. Membership, size, and intensity. The size of any interest group is an important resource. For instance, with nearly 38 million members, ARP can mobilize thousands of people in an attempt to influence elected officials' decisions regarding issues like mandatory retirement, Social Security, and Medicare. In addition, if an interest group's members are spread throughout the country, as are ARPs, that group can exert its influence on almost every member of Congress. The level of intensity that members exhibit in support of a group's causes also is critical. If a group's members are intensely dedicated to its causes, the group may be far stronger than its numbers would indicate. Members represent the lifeblood of an interest group because they generally fund its activities and they can be mobilized to write letters, send email messages, and engage in other forms of personal contact with legislators or administrative officials. For instance, even though a majority of Americans favor some form of gun control, they are outweighed in the political process by the intense feeling of the just over 4 million members who the NRA claims strongly oppose gun control. Information and communication. Information is one of the most powerful resources in an interest group's arsenal. Often the members of a group are the only sources of information on the potential or actual impact of a law or regulation. The long struggle to regulate tobacco is a case in point. While individuals witness their loved ones and friends suffering from lung disease, cancer, and heart problems, it took public health interest groups like the American Cancer Society, the Public Health Cancer Association, and the American Heart Association to conduct the studies, collect the data, and show the connection between these life-threatening illnesses and smoking. Of course, the tobacco industry and its interest group, the American Tobacco Institute, presented their own research to counter these claims. Not surprisingly, the tobacco industry's investigations showed no causal relationship between tobacco use and these illnesses. Eventually, the volume of information showing a strong relationship overwhelmed industry research suggesting otherwise. In 1998, the tobacco industry reached a settlement with states to pay millions of dollars for the treatment of tobacco-related illnesses. But information that isn't circulated cannot be a powerful tool. In a mediated era like ours, when most of us experience politics, if not life itself, through channels we do not control, it is imperative for those wanting to lobby government effectively to master the use of those channels. For a group to build and disseminate a moving narrative, it has to know who its audience is and how that audience accesses and shares information. There are increasing generational effects at work. While older people remain glued to the local news or maybe a cable outlet like Fox News, younger people curate the information they get. Cracking the code and using all available media will increasingly be crucial to an interest group's success at getting what it wants. 11.7 Citizenship and political groups. Power in numbers. Defenders of pluralism believe that group formation helps give more power to more citizens, and we have seen that it certainly can enhance democratic life. Parties and interest groups offer channels for representation and participation, and they help to keep politicians accountable. Pluralists also believe that the system as a whole benefits from group politics. They argue that groups will compete with one another and ultimately must form coalitions to create a majority. In the process of forming coalitions, groups compromise on policy issues, leading to final policy outcomes that reflect the general will of the people, as opposed to the narrow interests of specific groups or individuals. In this final section, we examine the claims of critics who argue that the politics of groups skews democracy, giving more power to some people than to others, and particularly discriminates against segments of society that tend to be underrepresented in the first place, poor people and young people, for instance. We have seen in this chapter that a variety of factors, money, leadership, membership, and information, can make a group successful. But this raises a red flag for American democracy. In American political culture, we value political equality, which is to say the principle of one person, one vote. And as far as voting goes, this is how we practice democracy. Anyone who attempts to visit the polls twice on election day is turned away, no matter how rich that person is, how intensely they feel about the election, or how eloquently they beg for another vote. But policy is not made only at the ballot box. It is also made in the halls and hearing rooms of Congress, the conference rooms of the bureaucracy, corporate boardrooms, private offices, restaurants, and bars. In these places, parties and interest groups speak loudly, and since some groups are vastly more successful than others, they have the equivalent of extra votes in the policymaking process. We are not terribly uncomfortable with the idea that interest groups with large membership should have more power. After all, democracy is usually about counting numbers. But when it comes to the idea that the wealthy, those who feel intensely, or those who have more information have an advantage, we balk. What about the rest of us? Should we have relatively less power over who gets what because we lack these resources? It is true that the major parties and interest groups with money have the distinct advantages of organization and access. Many critics suggest that business interests represent a small, wealthy, and united set of elites who dominate the political process, and there is much evidence to support the view that business interests maintain a special relationship with government and tend to unite behind basic conservative issues, less government spending and lower taxes. Other evidence, however, suggests that business interests are often divided regarding government policies and that other factors, such as membership, can counterbalance their superior monetary resources. Corporate money may buy access, but politicians ultimately depend on votes. Groups with large memberships have more voters. When a group's membership is highly motivated and numerous, it can win despite the opposition's lavish resources. Thus, what helps to equalize the position of powerful groups in American politics is the willingness on the part of citizens to fight fire with fire, politics with politics, and organization with organization, an effort made more accessible with the widespread use of the internet. It is, finally, the power of participation and democracy that can make pluralism fit the pluralist hopes. For some groups, such as poor people, such advice may be nearly impossible to follow. Other groups left out of the system, such as the merely indifferent or young people who regard current issues as irrelevant, will pay the price of inattention and disorganization when the scorecards of interest group politics are finally tallied.